Try that again. Good morning, everybody. Jim and Angela are out of town this week, so I'm having to do this all by myself. I'm accustomed to Jim being here and already ready to start, and so I do it by myself today. Shirley is doing as well as we can expect right now, still in a great deal of pain. She has an MRI scheduled for tomorrow, and then we'll find out what that tells us and where we go from there. So appreciate your interest, your concerns. Many of you made calls or sent cards, supplied food. I'm not the best cook and bottle washer, but we're getting along fine, and I do appreciate all of your interest. Let's begin with a prayer. Father, for another Lord's Day, we're grateful. For this class, we're grateful. As we continue our study of the epistles addressed to Timothy, we're grateful for the messages there and for the things that we can learn that applied to the church a long time ago in the first century and remarkably still apply to us. It's wonderful to deal with a timeless message. It works in each generation, and it affects us in our own lives on a daily basis. We're grateful for each member of this class, for the opportunity we have to continue in this study. We pray for Jim and Angela as they're out of town, and pray for their safe return and for our resumption of our normal schedule next week. Thank you for hearing our prayer and for blessing our study. In Christ's name, amen. Well, last week, as Jim led us in this discussion about the ministry of Timothy, we talked about the doctrine that needed to be taught, as well as the practices that needed to be engaged in. And so we learned a great deal about the things that Paul wanted to be sure Timothy was teaching, and he also wanted to be sure Timothy understood something about his own life and the example that he set for that church at Ephesus. He learned what to teach and how to live and how to minister, and those were subjects that we covered last week. If I can pursue something that I've been suggesting in all this study, the manual continues. The more I'm reading 1 Timothy, the more I'm convinced it serves as a kind of guidebook, a manual for the young preacher. And so the manual continues. We might be a little puzzled if we think about our subject for today. Why should the subject of widows be the next topic? Here Paul has been saying to Timothy, here's the way you're to conduct yourself, here are the things that need to be taught, and then all of a sudden he gets a very specialized topic. Let's talk about the role of widows in the church. Well, number one, I think Chad does a really good job of reminding us in our lesson that this is a practice that was enjoined upon God's people all the way back to the law of Moses. Chad quotes for us, for example, a passage from Exodus in which God said, "You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way and they cry out all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." He begins with those two kind of universal conditions, widows and the fatherless, and says you need to show proper concern for them, and if you don't, then your wives are going to become widows, and your children will become fatherless. The law of Moses expressed concern, a deep concern, for how to meet the needs for those people. That law is essentially repeated when we get to Deuteronomy, which is a second giving of the law. Cursed is the one who perverts the justice, due the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And then Chad cites for us a text from Psalm 94. The Lord watches over strangers. He relieves the fatherless and widow, but the way of the wicked he turns upside down. So three, at least very significant places in the Old Testament, we're told how to take care of widows and orphans. And we make an immediate jump from there to James chapter 1, verse 27, when James says, well, here's what pure religion is: to visit the fatherless and the widows and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. What James says is, let's boil religion down to two basic things. It's concern for others, particularly those in need, widows and orphans. And secondly, to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Maintain personal purity. Those are the sweeping statements, but when I look at all of that, it says to me that this is not quite an isolated topic. It relates to everybody. And then let me remind you, and I'm sure many of you thought of this already in reading this lesson, the first serious doctrinal problem that arose in the first century church arose over the care of widows. In Acts chapter 6, a great controversy had developed among the Hellenistic Christians because they said, you Jews are taking care of your widows, but you're neglecting our widows. And so they came to the apostles to register their complaint. And the apostles said, it's not appropriate that we should leave the teaching of the word to serve tables, so appoint 7 men to oversee this. And so they appointed 7 men. Incidentally, almost all of their names are Greek names, which says they picked people who would be particularly concerned about the Hellenistic or Greek Christians. I'm sure that Paul knew about that circumstance. I'm sure he knew exactly how that problem arose, and he had a personal identification with it. Because when an attack was made on one of those 7 men, Stephen, and he was stoned to death, a young man named Saul of Tarsus was standing by to hold the garments of those who murdered Stephen. Paul never directs a question to that problem in Acts 6, but he knew about it because he participated in the assassination of Stephen. So when we look at the place of widows as presented early in the church, it's not surprising that Paul would say, here's somebody you need to be concerned about. And so he's going to talk about what do we do about widows. We're going to divide our text into 3 passages, and we're going to start out with what Paul calls true widows or really widows. So if you will, let's look at beginning at verse 3 of chapter 5. Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow, you think Paul's trying to make a point here? That's the second time he's talking about really widows. She who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless, they being the real widows. Honor those who are really widows. The concept of honor simply shows some concern for them. Meet whatever needs you can. Those are the kinds of things. Most of us have heard about grass widows or straw widows. These are women who are not really widows. These are typically women who have been divorced, and their ex-husband may still be alive. Paul says the first line of defense in meeting the needs of these women is their families. And he's going to stress how important it is for families to accept their responsibility in that role. And so he says, if any widow has children or grandchildren, it's multi-generational. It's not just her own children, it goes to the next generation. Her grandchildren may need to participate in her care and take part of the responsibility of meeting her needs. If she has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home. They should have been brought up learning this. They should have been brought up learning what it means to care about the elderly in their family, a widow or a widower. We could include this for both. Let them learn respect, honor, those kinds of important principles. The way we treat our elderly, sorry folks, but that's all of us. The way we treat our elderly says a great deal about what we learned as children. My grandmother was in her late 80s and had difficulty walking. When Christopher would stay with her sometimes just for a visit, there was a neighborhood grocery that she liked to go to, and so he would walk with her to the grocery, and his explanation was to us, I held her hand because she don't walk good. Now, I'm sure my grandmother said to him, you need to hold my hand. She was protecting him, but he thought he was protecting her because she don't walk good. Well, I identify with that. I don't walk good either. Shirley doesn't walk very good either. But what do we learn even as children about taking care of those? And then it's interesting that Paul uses this expression, learn to repay their parents. One of the few places, I think, in the Bible where that principle is expressed, but what do children owe their parents? Most parents spend a great deal of time thinking about what I'm going to leave for my children. I'm going to provide for my children. But the text says those children need to provide for their parents, repay them, which says that they have a debt. They are indebted to their parents for their training, for their growth, for their maturity, for their physical needs, for their educational needs, their social needs, on and on and on. It might be wise, parents, for us to remind our children occasionally that they have a debt they have to learn to pay. So the first line of defense that Paul addresses in taking care of widows is the family. Be sure they understand exactly what's next. The second line of defense, he says, is the manner of life of that widow or those widows. Because he goes on to say, she trusted God. She continues in supplication and prayers night and day. Here's one totally devoted. I don't know if you remember early in the book of Acts, Mary and Joseph, on their way to the temple to provide the appropriate action for the birth of Jesus, meet a woman named Anna. She has been a widow for decades. And Luke says she spends all of her time at the temple in prayer, totally devoted to her service to God. And she welcomes them and pays appropriate respect for the child that they have. So she trusted God, continues in supplication. Essentially what Paul says about this woman in that second line of defense, he's concerned about her supplications and her prayers and the fact that they are constant and continuous. By contrast to those who are really widows, he says the one who lives in pleasure is dead. The other woman is alive and she's praying night and day. The other woman lives in pleasure and is dead. And then Paul quickly summarizes all of this by saying to Timothy, teach these things, command these things. So I think we could sort of summarize this thing about true widows or really widows. Paul lays down two principles for them. First, we need to know what their needs are. When James talks about visiting widows, we understand visiting is not just saying howdy. It's finding out what her circumstances are, what her needs are, and trying to meet those needs. So we learn about these women, what their needs are, and then what their manner of life is. Is she adapted to her way of life, but she's faithful to God, or not? Business of the young widow is going to be dealt with a little bit later. The second category that we talk about is neglected widows. I want to go back to an earlier thing that I started out by saying. It's interesting that Paul spent some time with a young preacher telling him how to deal with widows. You'd think that would not necessarily fall under his areas of responsibility. Shirley and I have had a favorite movie for a good many years. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called I Climbed the Highest Mountain. It is a story of a young Methodist preacher who is assigned to a very rural area in Georgia. He goes off to Atlanta and gets his wife and brings her back to this little rural community. And they have to adapt to a totally new way of life. He's very proud of his work as a minister and works very hard in the pulpit. But there comes in the church a very wealthy woman who has a home nearby that she spends her summers in. And she becomes fascinated with this young preacher. He seems knowledgeable and he's certainly handsome, and she begins to call on him. She's been having trouble understanding a passage from 2nd Chronicles. Most of us don't get too deep in looking at 2nd Chronicles. The young wife reminds her she needs to go home and take care of her husband and not worry about 2nd Chronicles. Young preachers are going to encounter that difficulty sometime. I learned very quickly from the advice of older preachers about spending too much time with the unmarried women. You're either going to encounter somebody who is trying to mother him, or you're going to encounter somebody who's trying to flirt with him. Paul doesn't use those two terms, but he's addressing a young preacher who needs to figure out, how do I deal with unmarried women in the congregation? Okay, that's kind of going back, but let's get that in. Okay, neglected widows. We have 2 isolated verses in our text that deal with this subject, so let's look at those. First, in verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This takes us right back to children and grandchildren taken care of. If they don't do that, if he's not provided for his own, if he hasn't taken care of his mother or his grandmother the way he should, he has neglected them. They fall in this category then. But if he does that kind of thing, Paul says 2 things about him. One, he's denied the faith. That's a strong statement. He has denied the faith. He said, I don't really believe what I said I believed. And that's true because he's not acting on it. He's not practicing what he'd been taught to practice. He's denied the faith, which says something about what's going on inside him. But secondly, he's worse than an unbeliever. What does he show himself to be to the community? He doesn't act like a believer. He doesn't act like somebody who's committed to the cause of Christ. He acts like an unbeliever because he's not done the things that he was trained to do. And then he picks up this again in verse 16 when he says, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. There's Paul's 3rd time. You think he's making a point? Those who are really widows. If a Christian man or woman, notice, a Christian man or woman has a widow in their family, let them, the family, relieve them, lest they become a burden to the church. Now, Paul's not saying the church doesn't have an area here of responsibility to meet, but he is saying the family takes the first responsibility. Don't let these people become burdens to the church if the family can provide. If they can't provide, the church has no other responsibility than to meet those needs. Neglected widows, neglected why? Either because the family doesn't care and they're not interested, or they're just not able. Not only does the neglected one suffer from this mistreatment, the church suffers because all of a sudden it's called upon to accept a responsibility that's not rightly theirs. The church suffers even from a bad reputation. You got families in your midst who are not taking care of their own family members, and so you have to pick up and do it. Paul turns from the widows to the family and talks about their responsibility. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. We're always to go first to the household of faith. The church should never be burdened by that kind of situation. A false assumption, please note this, a false assumption that the church has plenty of money. It's the same assumption we have with the government. Plenty of money. They can meet any need. Number one, where does the church, where does the government get its money? It comes from us. It comes from us. In the church, we offer our regular contribution. We're giving back to God that portion of ours that He rightly deserves. In the government, we pay our taxes. The assumption that there's just a wellspring of money there, the church can just do anything. No, not true. And if the church becomes burdened with responsibilities that do not rightly belong to the church, then it must neglect something else. The family cannot pass off its responsibility to the church by just assuming, well, they don't mind doing it. They don't mind doing it. But if other works suffer, then that's bad. So neglected widows have to be considered. Who's doing the neglecting? How are they being neglected? And what does that do to somebody else? Then Paul concludes this section by talking about the proper procedure for meeting these needs, and we pick up with verse 9. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work, but refused the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they've cast off their first faith. Let's go on to the second slide on that. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. Now let's go back to that previous slide so that I can start there. Thank you. Okay, what are the conditions? Paul reported in the Galatian letter that James and Cephas and John, whom he called pillars in the church, challenged him to remember the poor, which he said he was eager to do. Well, within that framework of remembering the poor, then certainly we're going to remember the needy widows. That's a responsibility. Similarly, we should be eager to care for widows and orphans that fall under our responsibility. Because church funds are not endless, contrary to some thinking, and because benevolence is not the only work of the church, as important as it is, some procedures must be established to determine those who are eligible for this kind of help. Paul specifies these. First is age. They have to be at least 60 years old. That's obviously an arbitrary age. The longevity that you and I are sharing now would say that we probably could make that a little older. But Paul is simply saying you have somewhere to start in determining who is really a widow. And he talks about age. Secondly, he talks about marital fidelity. She's had one husband. She served well. She was faithful in that responsibility. She is known for good works. And Paul is very specific about those. Well reported for good works. She's brought up children, been a good parent. She has lodged strangers. She's practiced hospitality, real hospitality, not just taking somebody home with you for Sunday lunch. Has practiced hospitality. The kinds of things Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 25. She has washed the saints' feet. She's really taken care of those within the brotherhood. Paul will say to the Galatians in that letter, as we have opportunity to do good to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. She's washed the saints' feet. She has relieved the afflicted. She's taken her time, her energy. I don't think of a better example of what's illustrated in that statement, relieve the afflicted, than Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, who relieved the afflicted, and it infringed on his time, his means of transportation, his money, his future, as well as the oil and wine he used to treat the wounds of that Samaritan man. And finally, she has diligently followed every good work. I want to tell you, that's a broad and comprehensive set of guidelines. And I think any of us, male or female, widow or widower, would do well to measure our lives by those principles. Those are the procedures that Paul sets for determining who we care for. They're pretty direct. They're pretty comprehensive. So he's talked about their age. He's talked about their marital fidelity. He's talked about her willingness to meet the needs of other people, good works. And then he turns to talk about young widows. Why does he set an age requirement? Well, at some age, at some point in age, that widow becomes unable to support herself. Young widows, they can support themselves. They're still able to work. He wants them to do that. Reviews young widows because they grow undisciplined. They become interested in only one thing, that's marry again. Nothing wrong with that. But they lose interest in all these other things that the older widow is commended for doing. The younger widow is going to have more difficulty with all of her good works, with bringing up children, with lodging strangers. There are difficulties there with that young woman. So refuse them. Paul goes a little farther and says about those younger widows, they become idle. They don't have anything to do. And as a result, they move around from house to house, just visiting, interfering with other women's work. They become gossips. Paul's pretty specific about the importance of avoiding gossiping. Busybodies, saying things they ought not. We know that kind of experience. Somebody has nothing else to do, they just get on the telephone and talk or tell things that they don't need to tell. I think that description can be characterized only as being a true mark of degeneration, just getting worse and worse. They become wanton, Paul says. His direction, here's what he would for young widows, and their situation is unfortunate, but they need to marry again. They need to have children. They need to manage the house. They may need to give no opportunity for the adversary, that is the devil, to speak reproachfully. Unfortunately, he says, some have already turned aside after Satan. They've already been caught in the snare. They've already been pulled away by his influence. In the description of Judas, we're told that Satan had already entered him. These women have turned aside after Satan. Paul gives similar advice in Titus chapter 2. In that passage when he says, I want the older women to teach the younger women, and they to teach them to marry, to care for their children, to be workers at home, all those kinds of things that are very important. Similar advice. So, what do we conclude out of Paul's advice about providing for widows? Again, it seems to be a kind of narrow focus within the church, but it needs attention. I would point out also, before we look at that conclusion, when Paul says we need to know about these women, we need to know their circumstances. Are they doing all these things that we've talked about? Those are the very things that give elders the right, the responsibility to investigate. The elders have every right to ask the right questions. Can we determine that indeed she's well reported for good works? What have we heard? What have we witnessed? How has she treated her children? What about her hospitality? What do I know about it? Sometimes we get the notion that elders don't have the right to ask the right questions. They do. Now, they don't ask them in order to become like the young widow so they can go out and gossip. What they ask must be maintained in confidence. I can assure you that if the elders knew something that was wrong in the lives of any one of us, we would not want them to broadcast it. And the next time you want to ask an elder what's going on, just think, he may not be able to tell you what's going on in the life of somebody else any more than he'd want to tell somebody else what's going on in your life. That's a big responsibility for elders. They have to maintain that confidence. So, what do I have for conclusions? Paul's advice to Timothy is very direct and specific. No vague generalities here. He gets right to the point of what he's expecting Timothy to do. Secondly, it is a defense of the youthful Timothy in his ministry. Young preachers need good advice. They need good mentoring. And that's exactly what Paul is doing for Timothy. An older man always understands the pitfalls better. That younger man needs his advice, his guidance. And then I would add that when reported, the elders have the responsibility to verify it. And when this advice is respected, it will help many churches avoid the very pitfalls that can come otherwise. What lessons did I come up with this? Number one, personal problems frequently become church problems. On all levels of our society, personal problems can become church problems. Without saying so, Paul explains why the elders have the right to inquire, that they may learn the correct status of those who are seeking help. Again, that's why confidentiality is a must among elders. Failing the family is failing the church. When a family neglects its own responsibility, they make the church suffer and fail. And it's interesting to me that Paul says absolutely nothing about widowers. I just have to assume that what he says about widows can apply in the appropriate circumstances. But he focuses entirely on the role of women. Well, that's today's manual installment. That's what we learned today. Jim will continue our study of 1 Timothy next Lord's Day. Thank you for being in our class.